Hi, and thanks for joining for the second session of the DI refresher called Building a Theory of Improvement, Interpretation and Ideation. The goals for today are that participants will be able to engage in interpretation and ideation, explain the purpose of a driver diagram and how to construct it, and explain what a theory of improvement is and why it is important. I'm Erin Anderson. I am an assistant professor at the University of Denver and the program lead for the design improvement program. And what that means is I work really closely with the district on developing the program and implementing it and designing a lot of the content. So interpretation and ideation, creating a theory of improvement. You all know that the first stage of this work is discovery. And in discovery, you're really digging in and trying to understand the problem from the user's perspective and really define that problem more clearly. So you may start with kind of a broad area of concern. Maybe it's math instruction is not ideal, and you've looked into your local data and you've figured out who that math instruction is working for, who it's not working for, in what ways. You've read some research about math instruction. You've maybe visited another school that solved a problem around math instruction, and you've done empathy interviews with a really diverse group of students to understand how they're experiencing this. And then you move into interpretation. And this is where you make sense of all of that information that you gathered in discovery. And in interpretation, you're really trying to tell stories and understand what the experience is like for the user. You're searching for meaning, and you're also framing opportunities. So you're looking at both areas where you need to improve, but you're also recognizing where your assets are, what's working really well, and trying to understand why what's working well is working well in order to help you solve for what's not working well. And so interpretation really involves a lot of causal analysis that then gets moved into a driver diagram, and you end up writing a clear aim statement or SMART goal around where you want to go to solve this problem. And I think in interpretation, a lot of times the problem gets redefined or gets greater specification through all of the work that happened in discovery and then in the interpretation as you're making sense of it. So this is really where you're bridging from gathering information to coming up with a really clear theory of improvement for what you want to have your work focus on for the year or for several years. So as a reminder, you're really starting out this work by saying, why are we getting the outcomes that we're currently getting? And why is there some kind of gap between the current performance and where we want to be? And so in the interpretation phase, this often goes into a fishbone diagram and where you outline what the various causes are of that gap that you've identified. And then from there, through that causal analysis, you identify a set of drivers that are driving the problem and could also be driving the solution to the problem. You can define those primary drivers with a little bit more information around secondary drivers. So primary drivers are the things we need to focus on, and the secondary drivers are kind of where we need to focus within that bigger bucket. And then you come up with change ideas that tie very closely to those identified drivers, all to drive progress on the aim that you've identified over there on the left-hand side of the driver diagram. So how do we do this? As I mentioned, we often start with a fishbone diagram. And so you take that clear problem statement that you may continue to be revising, that you've probably revised a little bit through discovery, and you really start to brainstorm potential clauses. And that can just be straight up brainstorming. Everybody has Post-it notes and they're writing down every idea they can think of that relates to the problem. You could use a 5 why protocol, and I'll talk about that in a second. But regardless, you're attempting to categorize or use affinity mapping to bring all of the ideas that you've come up with together into categories that can then go on to the fishbone. And then you can spend a little bit more time trying to understand within that category, are you missing anything that's related to that cause so that you can eventually choose from those causes a series of drivers that you think will help to solve the problem. So a fishbone diagram is really a summary of everything that you understand about what causes the problem. It's a visualization of the causes of the problem, and it really helps with scoping and identifying where you want to dig deeper, and identifying what you may know and might not know about the problem, and where you might need to go back into discovery to learn more. And it also, in this process, helps you to figure out what is within your control as a school and what might not be within your control but may still be a cause of the problem. And then you build consensus in the group, which is really helpful, because then you're making sure that everybody's starting out thinking about this problem in the same way, and they've identified the same causes for the problem. So as I mentioned, 5 whys is one great way to do this. And essentially you start with your initial question, what's the problem you're trying to solve? And you just keep asking, well, why is this a problem? Why, or how did this come to be a problem? And you keep asking and asking and asking until you feel like you've gotten down to a root cause. Now, sometimes in 5 whys, you might get down to something that you're like, aha, that's really the thing that we need to be working on. Sometimes each of these problem statements that you're putting in there along the way may each individually be causes that you need to consider further. It's not, there's not one right way to do it. Or your second why, you might want to pull out and do another 5 whys on, because you realize it's pretty multifaceted and you need to understand it more. So here's an example of a 5 whys. We've got a problem that we're going to, and the problem is that new teachers are leaving and they're not getting acclimated, not learning the school and district culture well enough, not becoming better teachers. And so they're not doing well, and then they're leaving. So you're starting to try to understand why. So why is the turnover rate for new teachers so high? Well, because new teachers are unhappy in their jobs. Well, why are they unhappy in their jobs? Because the working conditions are poor. Well, why are the working conditions poor? Maybe it's because the principal doesn't have relationships with the teachers and just doesn't have time to understand what conditions the teachers need. Well, why does the principal not have these good relationships? Because there's no structure for providing feedback and supporting teachers. Well, why is there not a structure for providing feedback and supporting teachers? Because there's no system for professional learning for new teachers. So through this 5 whys, you've really gotten down to like, professional learning is probably an area we need to attack. But you've also identified that relationships are an issue, that working conditions are an issue, that there's not a feedback loop, which might be part of the professional learning or may not. And so you're really starting to uncover what some of these causes may be. Another example is if you started with understanding why the rate of learning for these new teachers is low. Well, they're not comfortable asking for help. Well, why are they not comfortable asking for help? Because they don't have the relationship with the principal or other teachers. Well, why don't they have a good relationship? Because there's no professional learning community. Well, why is there no professional learning community? Because professional learning is not a focus at the school. Well, why is that not a focus? Because there's not a culture that supports learning and collective responsibility for student learning. So through the first 5 whys, we really got down to PD. The second 5 whys, we really got down to the idea that there's not a culture that supports this and people don't have collective responsibility for learning. And again, those may end up being 2 of the drivers that you eventually focus on. But they definitely are probably going to be categories on your fishbone diagram to start to understand them a little bit more. And so here's a sample fishbone diagram that comes from those 2 5 whys. And you can see here that it's come to 6 major causes that have been categorized. And those are weak relationships with the principal, inadequate feedback, poor working conditions, and then on the bottom, ineffective PD, lack of professional community, and ineffective recruiting, hiring, and placement strategies. So you could have gotten to these through a series of 5 whys and then picking the things out of there that you felt were most important or the highest leverage causes. You could also get to this by just brainstorming. And then categorizing. So you might brainstorm and find, for instance, like if we look at lack of professional community, that some people mentioned there's not collective responsibility, others said it's not my job, others mentioned that they have to invent new curriculum every time, other people mentioned inadequate time, resources, and structures, and those all got grouped together through affinity mapping into a cause of lack of professional community. So this part can be messy because there's not one right way to do it. Your team just needs to figure out what works for you to eventually get to a point where you've laid out a fishbone diagram that has causes and sort of sub causes or branches off those causes that explain them a little bit more and are more specific. So what can eventually happen then is that these causes often end up becoming the drivers that end up on your driver diagram and focus your work. So here's a poster or several pictures of people creating fishbone diagrams. When this is done in live space, it usually involves a lot of Post-it notes and a lot of brainstorming and grouping. You can also do this on an online space. There's a lot of really great tools, including miro.com, that has a fishbone template that people can all be working on at the same time. But it's really a lot about the process and about bringing your team together to talk about the problem and lay out as much information about it as possible. And you also want to think about in this phase that those causes, those things that you write on those sticky notes, should be informed by discovery. So they should be informed by your empathy data. And you might even want to mark in some way which ideas came from that versus your local data versus research to kind of keep track of where your thinking came from. But really, this is about coming together and building some consensus as a team. So some tips to building a fishbone diagram are avoid just jumping to solutions. You got to be laying out causes, not solutions. You want to have as many causes on there as you can think of. And you really want to stay user-centered and think about the data. One thing that is really important is that you do this work with an open mind and you consider a variety of perspectives, but that you recognize that unconscious bias exists. And you need to check yourself as a group as you're doing this to see in what ways you might be perpetuating biased ideas, such as racist ideas in your causes. So if you see that a number of the causes that you're laying out put the onus of the responsibility on the students or parents, then you might need to stop and as a group really think about why that's happening. What are some of the underlying ideas or stereotypes or reasons why you're placing the onus on outside of the school and onto the users. So unconscious bias is really important to think about at this stage, and built into the process are some prompts and questions for you to stop and think about to just make sure that your ideas really do consider a variety of perspectives and are not somehow biased. So from there, you take those causes and you really start to move into drivers or high leverage areas that you believe will influence your problem, close your gap, and lead to better outcomes. And typically having about 3 to 5 drivers to start out with is ideal, and they should be somewhat similar in their kind of what grain size or like how important they are and what level of organization they're within. And they can be found through, as I said, fishbone and 5 whys and affinity mapping. And you're really thinking about the processes, structures, systems, or practices that are driving the problem and could be driving the solution. And at that point, as you're kind of thinking about those drivers, you're also revisiting the problem and you're redefining the problem as an aim statement. And so you really want to get specific about the problem you're trying to address. You're going to write an aim statement that includes specific measures of progress towards that problem, And you really want to think about measurement. How are you going to know on an ongoing basis if you're moving towards this aim? And this is where it's often referred to as the small dot or big dot aim. So an example at the bottom there is that your aim for your improvement project might be to reduce the turnover of teachers from 50% to 25% by June 2021, as measured by the percentage who indicate that they're planning to stay in June 2021. That you can't measure till the end of the year. So sometimes people will then have small dot aims or ways to see along the way if you're making progress towards that aim. So that might be doing monthly anonymous surveys, just saying how many of you would like to stay if you were asked, at this point in time. And you could do that a few times quarterly to see if you are starting to make progress or not. One thing to really think about is that ideally, the way you're measuring your aim is something that you could check in on a monthly basis. So iStation data can be great for that. A lot of people sometimes use attendance data or other already available data that you're looking at. And one thing to keep in mind that's really important is you still have a problem statement. But your aim is a little bit different in that it's the goal you're trying to get to when you solve that problem. And so your problem may still be turnover, but you might write an aim statement that's looking at some other piece of data that's relevant to turnover. So that could be school culture surveys or things like that. So what you're really trying to get to is a clear statement with operational definitions. It's measurable, specific, and it's in your control, it's doable, it's incremental, and you're going to lay out what that time frame and specific target population is. And always go back to that empathy data to make sure that the aim statement is impactful. So then that aim goes on to your driver diagram. That's what you're specifically trying to accomplish. Those drivers also go on there. Those are the things that you believe are going to drive your aim. And then you start to brainstorm what changes we could introduce that would make a shift within the driver and eventually the aim. And this is your theory of improvement. So your driver diagram is essentially the physical version of your theory of improvement. And what you're really trying to think about is, as you're coming up with these change ideas, is if I do this thing, that will impact this driver, which will in turn impact the aim. So in many ways, it's just about getting really tight and strategic in your solutions so that the solutions are driving something that you know is a key leverage point, and something that you may be able to measure along the way to see if you're making progress. So to come up with those change ideas, again, you're brainstorming. So you want to get the right people at the table. You probably want to have some kind of norms or rules around what brainstorming looks like. And then you're trying to really get down to the most promising ideas out of all these ideas you've brainstormed. And this is where the design thinking element really comes in, is that you should try to think big, defer judgment, come up with wild ideas, build off each other, stay focused, go for quantity, think outside the box, and then you can pick the things that you think will be most helpful. But don't try to have that conversation as you're brainstorming. Brainstorm first, then pick out the ideas later. And these change ideas can come from research. What does the academic literature say about the problem? It can come from what other organizations have done. So again, some of that information you collected in discovery. It can come from being really creative, and it can come from analyzing the problem really closely. So change ideas can come from all of these places. So as you're doing that initial discovery, you're not only refining your problem, but you're also starting to work towards what are some of the change ideas that we might be able to work? What are some of our drivers? What are the causes of this? So then you create this theory of improvement, and always remembering that it's possibly wrong and definitely incomplete. You lay out what the drivers are, and then you're really trying to get to essentially a change package, a series of change ideas that are moving that aim statement forward. And you really are thinking about what works and how does it work for whom and under what conditions. So each time you're implementing a change idea, that's what you want to focus on. What's working, who's it working for, under what conditions. And that's where the PDSA cycles come in, is you design these change ideas and you test them out. And that's how you start to be able to answer that question about what works for whom, under what conditions. And then you eliminate change ideas that aren't working. And they might not work because you might not have identified the right drivers, or they might not work because they just weren't right for your context, or you might need to adapt them and try again with some slight tweaks till you get to something that you're able to sort of measure and recognize as working. But this is where you're headed in all of this work, is to develop this theory of improvement and create this change package that you could then say to other people, okay, your aim statement is to increase the number of students who meet performance benchmarks in reading. Well, these ideas are moving our kids forward in reading. Maybe you could try them as well. And that's where the networked element of this comes in. So again, a reminder that you're going to probably have a bunch of versions of this theory of improvement. It's not fixed. You'll start with one. You might add drivers along the way. You might brainstorm more change ideas as time goes on. So it's constantly iterating and improving and changing over the course of the process. And when you're looking at that driver diagram, you want to stop and make sure that there is consensus on this shared aim, that everybody on the team feels like that's what you should be focusing on, that you've identified ways to measure and document both progress as well as improvement, that you have taken the time and space to brainstorm those change ideas, that you've theorized the cause and effect relationships. So that's through that fishbone diagram. And then you've identified system elements or drivers, and the what being the primary driver and the where being the secondary driver, that are the pieces of the system that are related to your problem. So if anybody has any questions, here is a link that you can click on or copy and add any questions in there, and I'm happy to answer them. Thanks again for taking time to watch this, and please feel free to reach out to myself, your coaches, or Sandy Lockheed at the district if you have any questions or concerns or barriers to this work. We're all here to support. So thanks and have a good day.